My name is Jenny and I'm the director here at the museum and really excited to introduce Michael Weiss to you. He's been interested in orcas since he was at least 4 years old. That was when he was able to actually say what it was he was interested in, probably at birth. And he is now a lead researcher and partner with Monika on the Orca Behavior Institute, which is a nonprofit organization, and you can find out more about them on Facebook using Orca Behavior Institute. You can find their page, and they are in the middle of a fundraising campaign and would appreciate your support. But we're really excited that Michael will be here to talk about some of his research work. He's recently graduated from Reed College. He started interning here at the Whale Museum. We hear it was in 2013. We had a big dispute. I thought it was 2010. He thought it was 12. She knows it's 2013. So that settles it. I'm excited to hear about some of the work that you've been doing and to understand what multidimensional social structure of resident killer whales means. So please join me in welcoming Michael.
Thank you very much. I am Michael. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about killer whale social structure, specifically focusing on this idea of a multidimensional social structure in our resident killer whales. And so what does that mean when I say multidimensional social structure? So animal social structures are kind of built on the bonds that animals make with one another. And you kind of have four major areas. There's a lot of variation, but four major classifications. So this top row, there was text here when I got cut off. This top row would be kind of single level social structures. That is where you belong to a group and the ties you form are dependent on what group you belong to. On this bottom row, you have what's called a multi-level social structure, in which within those groups there are actually smaller groups nested within those levels that actually have tighter bonds. You see that in humans, you see that in a lot of dolphins and other cetaceans, you see that in primates as well. Now, what these columns represent is on the top, on the left column, you have groups that are organized by kinship. That means you spend your time with the animals that are most closely related to you. And on the right, you have groups that are not organized by kinship. These are non-kinship structures. Vampire bats, for instance, will share food with pretty much anyone, given that they think they are going to reciprocate that act. Similarly, groups of bottlenose dolphins, specifically male bottlenose dolphins, will form alliances, mostly to secure mates, with non-kin. While most primates and bees, very much so for bees, form social structures almost entirely based on relatedness, on kinship. Now, well, what about, where do humans fit into this? So this would be a diagram of a single level social structure. This would be a diagram of a multi-level social structure. And just to kind of orient you here, this is a network representation. Each of these dots is a node representing an actor. That could be an individual or a group. And each of the ties here would be a social bond. And the thicker the tie is, the stronger that social bond. So here's a single level social structure where the only thing determining what bonds you make is basically the group you are in. Here's a multi-level social structure. Within that group, there are actually tighter clusters formed. And then on the right here, you have what's called what I call a multidimensional social structure, where not only do you have these multi-levels, these nested levels, but you will also form bonds, these red ties, with animals that aren't in whatever level you form. This is kind of actually what humans have. So think about how human society works. You are born into a kinship group, your family, and you maintain ties with your kinship group typically throughout your life, most human social structures, but at the same time you will also form bonds with non-kin. You'll make friends, you'll have you'll work with people, you'll have all kinds of groups that you belong to that are not based on kinship. And this is what we mean when we talk about multidimensional social structure. There's the kinship dimension and the non-kinship dimension. So, text didn't transfer over that. That's really exciting. So, what about killer whales? Our resident killer whales absolutely have a multi-level social structure. We know this for sure. Each killer whale belongs to a matriline. That is a close, immediate family unit based on matrilineal kinship, so you stay with your mom's group. Those matrilines organize into subpods, which are slightly less related, so as this arrow goes down, you get less and less related. And those subpods organize into the pod units. In the southern residents, we have J, K, and L pod. And those are kind of the big extended family groups. And then those pods all organize into communities or populations. So we know from all these years of study of how killer whales organize themselves that they have multi-level social structure. But we also know from a lot of work over the years and some statistical modeling, this was a paper published in 2009, that this social structure is kind of dynamic. The social clusters they'll form change from year to year, sometimes forming social clusters that cross these pod boundaries. So you'll have a cluster with some J pod and some L pod and some K pod or any combination that doesn't really represent a kinship group. So what's going on here? One second, I got ahead of myself. So I really, with the work we've been doing with Orca Behavior Institute, with my thesis, I wanted to look into this non-kinship social structure to kind of see what was going on there, what were the drivers behind it, what were the consequences, and can we kind of model this? So how do we do that? Well, we have a boat called Serenity. There's Monika driving the boat. She didn't know that her picture was going to be in this presentation. We have a boat. We also take where we will actually take observations of killer whale groups. We can identify killer whales based on their dorsal fin and their saddle patch. Each whale is unique. So we can kind of see which individuals are spending time with each other each time we go out and encounter these whales. We also take observations from shore. And this is kind of how we spent both this summer and the previous summer. Orca Behavior Institute was founded last year. We spent our first field season taking hydrophone recordings, behavioral observations, and also just noting what animals were in any group that we encountered. And like I said, we can identify them by that unique dorsal fin and saddle patch, and we can take note of what groups we see. So what we're really interested in here is when it is a case in which animals that are not related by kinship, are not related genetically, form a preferred association. We're looking at when animals prefer to hang out, basically, with an animal that's not related to them, or a family group that's not related to them. So how do we do that? Well, this is going to get a tiny bit mad. So essentially the data we have is a list of groups of whales that we've seen, and a list of individuals. This is kind of just an example of an observation of 5 groups and 4 individuals. And if there's a 1, that means that individual was seen in that group. And if there's a 0, that means that individual wasn't seen in that group. So from this data, we can figure out how basically the association rates between these animals. Now, how do we know whether or not that's preferred? How do we know whether or not that means they're actually preferring to spend time with this other animal? Well, we can basically flip this matrix a bunch of times. We can take a 0 here, replace this 1, and place this 0 and 1. And now we have a slightly randomized matrix where each individual is still seen in the same number of groups, and each group contains the same number of animals, but it's randomized. And if you do that enough times, you end up with a pretty much completely randomized matrix with the same number of groups, same number of individuals per groups, and same number of groups that each individual is in. This kind of gives you your null model for association rates between individuals. So we flip that matrix 100 times, calculate new association indices, repeat that 20,000 times to build that kind of distribution, and we compare the randomized networks to the observed network. When we do that, these are the preferred associations we see. So each node, each circle is a matriline, not an individual whale. And each tie is a preferred association. It's a case when two matrilines prefer to spend time with each other more than you'd expect by chance. The red lines are cases in which matrilines prefer to associate with matrilines from a different pod. And this is data taken from last year. And if you run a community detection algorithm on this network, you actually find, again, the text is gone, you find a social cluster here that's made up of actually members of all 3 pods. This is really interesting. These are kind of what we expect. You expect to find social clusters where L pod is hanging out with other L pod whales, K pod is hanging out with other K pod whales, and J pod is hanging out with J pod whales. But here we have what's called J subgroup A, which is the J2s, J2 and the J14s and the J19s, with 1 matriline from K pod, the K14s, which is made up of 4 whales, and 1 lone male whale named L87. who has actually been spending time with JPod since 2010. So the first question we kind of wanted to ask about what might be going on here is, could this be a case where pods are actually rearranging themselves? We've been studying these whales since the 60s, so we believe pods are stable kinship groups, but maybe pods are fluid, maybe pods switch up all the time. And the way we can test that is by looking at kind of their call repertoire. The main thing that delineates these pods from each other is they actually have vocal dialects. They sound different from each other. They make different calls. On this chart, each kind of spot on the x-axis is a different call type that these whales may make. The height of the bar indicates the percent of their calls that that call type makes up, and color represents each pod. And you can see there's a lot of difference. You know, J-pod mostly makes S1s, K-pod is making S16s and S17s, and L-pod makes S19s and S2 type 3s. This gives us the fact that pods have these unique repertoires gives us a way of testing whether or not these new social clusters we found are actually new pods. So we can look at, we can use information theory to actually look at the variability of this cluster's call repertoire. So this is cluster A. This is our cross-pod cluster here, and this is the first order entropy in bits, which is basically a measure of variability in their calling repertoire. And here is a bunch of single pod clusters as well as full pod repertoires. And you can see really clearly that the call repertoire for our cross-pod cluster is much more variable than you would expect from a single pod. So from this we kind of say, well, the repertoire doesn't look like a single pod repertoire. You don't think that this is a pod reforming. This is something else. This is a different dimension of the killer whale social structure. So what gives? What's going on with these ties we found if it's not a new pod? And the reason, this is kind of an important question. When animals live in groups, there are costs to spending time with other animals. There's increased competition for food, there's increased disease transmission, there's an increased competition for pretty much everything. So the only way that animals get to live in groups is if there's some kind of benefit. Like wolves, they compete for food, but they help each other to bring down large prey items. Killer whales, we think the main benefit that comes from their kinship groups is that they are kin. If you help out someone who's related to you, evolutionarily, that helps your genes because they have a lot of the same genes you do. If you're hanging out with animals that don't share a lot of genetic material with you, what is the benefit from that association? So what fitness benefits, if any, are gained from these cross-pod associations? Now, we can't rule out one possibility, which is just social error. Sometimes social animals, like humans or like donkeys and dogs, will just make social bonds with animals because that is typically the right thing to do. It usually helps to be social and make social bonds, and sometimes you make a mistake and you make a social bond with the wrong individual. This is also the case in cuckoo birds, which actually are nest parasites. They will actually deposit their eggs in the nests of other birds, and then their baby will hatch. This other bird is now responsible for feeding this huge chick at the expense of its own chicks, and it just does it because its parental instincts kick in. So we can't, when I talk about fitness benefits, keep in mind we can't really rule out that killer whales are just having social error when they hang out with animals they're not related to because they're extremely social. But keep in mind also, killer whales have those nifty dialects that are really good at probably very helpful in delineating kin from non-kin. So it seems unlikely, but it is a possibility. So there was more text on this slide, but the first question I want to ask is, do killer whales in these cross-pod clusters actually exhibit high levels of mating activity? We know from previous genetic studies that most of the mating killer whales do is outside of their pod. Males will, during big multi-pod gatherings, males will go and mate with members of other pods, then they'll go back to their pod and continue swimming with mom. So in general, you would expect that if you're spending more time with potential mates, maybe your mating, your fitness through mating has increased. So how do we test that? Well, we look for high levels of mating activity in this cross-pod social cluster. But what we find is that in a single pod group, whales spend very little of their time in what we would call potentially sexual behavior, about 3% of their time. When you have two pod groups that are made up of multiple social clusters, it shoots up. It's over 25% of their time is spent potentially mating. But when we go to this cross-pod cluster that we're looking at, it's back down to only about 3% of their time. So it doesn't really seem like the purpose of this aggregation is having babies. So what are they doing? All of this is on this slide. Okay, well I can explain what was on here. Luckily I actually did this. So a really important part of any animal's life, but particularly our killer whales because of kind of a lack of food, is foraging. Killer whales have to find food. And there are really two really important social roles that exist during foraging. The most important probably is that of the older post-reproductive females. They are there's some work recently that shows that they kind of function as a repository of ecological knowledge. That means the older females know where to find fish, and this becomes particularly important in years when there's not very many salmon. So a post-reproductive female is really important, but not every match line has a post-reproductive female. Similarly, adult males have a much larger body size, they go on longer dives. They are likely able to fish in areas that other individuals are not able to fish. That makes them, as well, a very important potential social role during foraging. To kind of illustrate that, here's kind of your ideal matriline. You have a post-reproductive female who leads everybody to areas of high salmon density, and you have an adult male who can dive down into deep water, grab fish that the other whales can't get to, and sometimes brings it back and shares with the rest of the matriline. But what if you only have an adult male in your matriline? Yes, the male can still dive down and get those fish that no one else can get, but you don't have anyone leading you to areas of high salmon density. You end up with being in areas with low salmon density, and the fitness of every individual in that group is lower. Similarly, if you only have a post-reproductive female, you find areas with high salmon density, but no one can take advantage of these fish down here. And again, as a unit, your fitness is lowered. So, those two groups could reclaim some of those fitness benefits by actually teaming up, by working together, where the post-reproductive female leads the group to areas of high salmon density, and the adult male can take advantage of those deeper fish. So to kind of test this hypothesis, which my thesis advisor termed the tandem hypothesis, because she imagined these two matrilines like two pieces of a tandem bicycle coming together to make something that actually works. We used exponential random graph models, which I'm sure everybody is just so excited to hear those words. So this is a statistical method developed in social sciences to study human social networks. The idea is you can model any graph or a network based on the local processes that help form it. That can be homophily, which means you want to hang out with animals that are similar to you. That can be triad formation, in which case if I'm a friend with A and C is also a friend with A, I'm probably going to be a friend with C. Friend with a friend with X. From that, we can model that and extract statistics from that and have associated parameters, which kind of indicates the likelihood of that happening in that particular statistic or that particular motif happening in the network. We can extract those parameters and then generate a bunch of graphs, a bunch of networks, random networks, that have those same parameters to the probability of tide formation. That's hard reading. Well, what that slide was going to say is that what I did is I took that network that I showed you earlier, I coded each matriline for whether or not it had an adult female, an adult male, or a post-reproductive female rather, an adult male or both, or neither. I ran it through an exponential random graph model, modeling for pod homophily. That's a really obvious thing that we know happens in these groups. You want to form ties with members of the same pod. Triad formation, which is the friend effect, as well as the baseline probability of an edge, and whether or not different demographics just have different gregariousness in general, different sociality. And from that model, I then simulated a bunch of models, 20,000 models. This is that original graph with each matriline color-coded according to its demographics. And this is an example of one of those simulated graphs. You can see they're different in a lot of ways, but the same basic structure of it is maintained, the same basic parameters. And we can then take those simulated graphs and compare those networks and the dyads, the edges that occur in that network, to the edges in the observed network. So in our observed network, we have 4 cross-pod dyads, where a group that only has an adult male formed a bond with a group that had neither. We also have 4 dyads in which a group with an adult male, only an adult male, formed a bond with a group that only had post-reproductive female. This is our tandem association that we're really interested in. And then we had 1 cross-pod dyad where 2 groups with only adult males associated. When we compare that to our, so these plots here, these kind of violin plots, these are the distributions we expect based on our simulations. And these red lines are the observed value in the network. And what we find is that tandem bonds are very much overrepresented in our observed network compared to what we expect by random chance. So this is actually pretty good evidence. It's only 1 year of data. We want to collect a lot more and continue to test this. That in cross-pod association, having these tandem social roles filled is actually a really important factor. It might even be the driving factor behind some cross-pod associations. The K14s have a big adult male. His name is K26 Lobo. Meanwhile, the J2s and J14s have no adult males, but they do have the single oldest female in the population. So it very much could be the case that J2, Granny, and her group is allying with this group or other groups or L87 to get that adult male social role filled. Meanwhile, these other groups are looking for a post-reproductive female to lead them to areas with high salmon density. So I said in the little flyer said we're going to link this to environment, so let's do it. So what are the environmental factors influencing the non-kinship dimension? Well, we don't really know. We only have one year of data to go off of. But we do know from previous studies, like this study done in 2012 by Emma Foster, that killer whale social structure is really dependent on salmon abundance. The more abundant salmon gets, the more connected a killer whale social network gets, and vice versa. So in times of really low salmon, you end up with a much less densely connected social network. So we don't have a ton of data on the specific effects of that on intrapod and cross-pod associations, but it seems likely that it would have some effect. Similarly, so the one question for this is, why do killer whale social networks become less connected when there's less salmon? To kind of answer this question, I used data collected at Line Kiln by Bob Otis and his volunteers over the last 26 years of killer whale behavior as they pass through the park. And what you find is, as salmon abundance increases, you end up with more surface-active behavior in killer whales. The killer whale's surface-active behavior tends to indicate socializing, tends to indicate play. So in years where there's more salmon, the whales play more, which makes a lot of sense. If you don't have as much food, you're going to have less energy to play. Also, you're going to need to spend more of your time looking for food. You're going to have less time to socialize. The less time you socialize, the weaker those social bonds are going to get, and you're going to end up with a less connected social structure. Similarly, as food gets less abundant, whales become more dependent on matriarchs, on the post-reproductive females. This is from a study done in 2015 by actually that same lab that produced the Foster paper, showing that when salmon's low, the leader score, the leadership of post-reproductive females increases pretty dramatically. So we kind of start to get this picture of a less connected social structure, a more diffuse social structure that is more reliant on individuals who are important for finding food. And so it's very possible that as food gets less abundant, and when there's demographic limitations, for instance, if a bunch of matrilines don't have adult males, or a bunch of matrilines have no post-reproductive females, that is going to drive the formation of these non-kinship bonds. Again, we need a lot more, many more years of data to actually confirm some of these hypotheses, but it's kind of an exciting opportunity to look into the evolutionary drivers of non-kinship cooperation, because that's a kind of a big question in the evolution of human social structure as well. So the outstanding question is, what role specifically do adult males play in southern killer whale social structure? Like I said, they dive deeper, they have longer dive times, they have these bigger, stronger bodies, but we don't know for sure that what they do for a matriline is getting that fish from deeper water and bringing it back. The next question is, what are the consequences of these bonds? What happens to killer whale culture and social structure when you get these bonds? So I want to come back to L87onyx, who's been with JPod for a few years now. He's this big, beautiful adult male. He's a lot of people's favorites. So as he is with JPod, he seems to have adopted J2 as kind of a maternal figure. So one big question we might have is, what influence has J2 and the rest of JPod had on his dialect, that unique LPod dialect, and conversely, what effect has he had on the dialect of the young males in JPod? We know, and it's kind of comparing apples and oranges, but we know from captive whales that young males will learn the calls of adult males they're housed with. Now that's in a time where the social structure around them is so vastly different from what we have here that we don't know if that translates over to wild whales at all. But it's an interesting question to ask. So we can look at the vocalizations. Now keep in mind these are kind of low sample sizes because it's really hard to get a recording of just one matriline or just one whale. This is a heat map, just kind of to orient you. The lighter the box is, the more similar the recorded repertoire we have is of the two animals that it's kind of on the intersection of. So the diagonal will be sub-similarity, and all these other boxes are similarity between matrilines. And this is kind of just a simplified network representation of this heat map with the distance between any 2 points roughly being equal to their similarity. So what you see is that there's J16s over here, which is the only matriline other than this kind of J2, JA subgroup that I actually got a single matriline recording of in JPod. And they're most similar to the J2s, but the J2 and L87 are very similar to each other, at least based on these recordings that we had. Now, keep in mind again, these are low sample sizes, and we're still going over a lot of recordings. This is kind of preliminary. So it's very interesting. Most of the patterns are very much what you'd expect. You have these L-pod whales grouped together, these K-pod whales grouped together, and the J is separate from those two. But then you have these two matrilines here, the J2 subgroup and L87, who actually have more similar vocal repertoires than you really expect. So this is very much motivation for us to continue recording from L87 and from the JA subgroup to try to get a better idea of what influence they've had on each other's vocal signatures. Yeah, that shows up. So, but again, going back to this idea of a full pod repertoire, one of the questions we really have is what happens to the entire pod's repertoire when you end up with these non-kinship bonds. That allows for information transfer from one pod to another a lot more easily. So what happens to these repertoires rate changes in social structure? We know theoretically from this, so a lot of work done by Kyle Whitehead in his lab, what the effects of network structure on cultural transmission should be. So killer whales very much have a modular social structure. We have these tightly knit groups that have kind of small interactions with each other, but for the most part it's this tight-knit social group. So we know that as you get less modular, cultural transmission should get faster as you get less modular, and more importantly, it should get less consistent and less persistent. So we would expect, as you end up with these kind of bonds across these modules, that you end up with a lot of kind of changes in repertoire structure and in the transmission of different call usage. So to give you an idea of what we're talking about when I'm talking about differences in social structure, this is association data. This is not call similarity anymore, from 2005. Again, the lighter they are, the more they spend, the more similar they are in sighting history. And the boxes represent within pod ties. And this is a pretty consistent pattern, I think, that within the pod you are almost always associated, and outside the pod it varies a lot. Now, this is from 2006. You see a little bit of a difference, or a little bit of a decrease in pod modularity, where actually they're spending sometimes less time with animals inside their own pod. And then we have 2015. That has no discernible pattern to it, really, that I can pick out. You can see that the K-pod and J-pod spend a lot of time together, and L-pod was all over the place. So we're really interested in what happened to the dialects of these pods between here and there. And we're still working on getting that data together and actually trying to answer some of these questions. but we have enough to kind of preliminarily make a few observations between 2005 and 2006. Remember that in 2006, pod modularity was a little lower. Pods were a little less insular. They were spending a little more time outside of their own pod. So we have these slight differences in call type usage. The light bars are J-pod and the dark bars are K-pod. We have not gotten enough data together to analyze L-pod yet for these 2 years. So this is kind of a lot to take in. It's kind of hard to say from these two plots which is more similar, which is more diverse. Luckily, we can use information theory to actually empirically compare these two repertoires. And we find that in 2005, the similarity between J and K pods vocal repertoires was actually quite a bit less. So the higher the divergence, the less similar the repertoires were. So in 2005, we actually had a much less similar repertoires between J and K pod than we did in 2006. Now, these are only 2 years, and 2 social networks, and 2 call repertoires. We need a lot more data before we can say anything certain about this pattern at all. This is kind of a proof of concept that we can compare social network correlates with call repertoire characteristics. So what are the next steps? We need many more years of acoustic data and association data. We need a lot more. And we really want to investigate more of LAD7's influence and the influence of LAD7 on J-pod and vice versa. So actually that's all I've got for now. That went a lot quicker than I expected, thanks to a lack of text. But I'd like to thank the Web Museum for having me here. I'd like to thank Bob Otis and all of his volunteers for collecting data for 26 years. And a huge thanks to the rest of the OB team. Could not have done any of this without them. And with that, I will take your questions. Feel free to raise your hand or shout at me. Yeah.
Thanks very much for showing these results. Very, very interesting to see. My question would be about the clusters that you defined, so the new subgroups kind of. You have compared at the end of each walk with data from 2005 to 2006. Why could one not just conduct the same or carry out the same definition of clusters for previous years? Is it just data inhomogeneity?
Yeah, you can do it. One problem is that we have data on associations from those years, but they're mostly land-based and kind of opportunistic. So it is slightly different kinds of data collection. You could do some of the same analysis, and I'm actually kind of working on doing some of that. Yeah, the idea would be that you'd have years and years of the same kind of group by individual data, and you would perform the same analysis, make preferred association matrices, and then do the same modeling. The thing is, even with 3 years of data, which is kind of what we have right now, 2005, 2006, and then 2015, it's really kind of hard to pick out any more patterns than you'd see from 1 year. What you really need is a huge time course of maybe 10, 15 years. But that's exactly the idea, is taking old data and doing similar analysis. Yes?
What you're describing, it could be seen as whales adapting, moving to a new structure, or it could be seen as environmental selection, that somehow the pods that make these ties will survive longer. It strikes me that one of the ways to see really the consequences would be to look at whale mortality, because if you're correct that these adaptations are actually going to help increase their fitness, then over time the mortality for the pods would decrease. Do you have enough information already to say whether in fact the pods that have gone to the matrilineal, the adult male and the post-reproductive female, is there any sign that they have lower mortality?
That's a great question. And the short answer is we don't have any definite answers to the question of if you have a post-reproductive female and an adult male, do you do better? We do have pretty good data showing that if a whale loses its mother, especially the males, mortality goes up. It's especially true for adult males. Adult male mortality increases a lot after their mother dies. But in terms of the actual fitness of the whole matriline, or a subgroup in response to having a post-reproductive female and adult male, there's not as much data that we've looked at, and especially not in conjunction with the network analysis showing whether or not they borrowed a post-reproductive female or borrowed an adult male. That's a great question, and that's definitely kind of an important next step to go with this hypothesis. Yes?
But wouldn't it be difficult to eliminate the correlation of lower salmon to change those pods, because you've got two variables, more than two, but certainly two identifiable variables that would affect mortality?
Yeah, you'd absolutely, any model you built predicting survival based on demographics or network structure, you would have to take into account environmental factors. I think that's a really excellent point. Yes?
The environmental factors actually mean our residents are endangered, and NOAA is saying they're looking at extinction.
Yeah.
So there's massive behavioral changes going on because they're so compromised. So it seems as though it would be very difficult to find doing sustaining research that actually reflects how they were back in 2000, in the early 2000s.
Yeah, well, it is interesting to try to compare, data from 2005, 2006 with data from today. You're right. Anecdotally, the behaviors changed immensely. You look at some data that some researchers were collecting in 2005, 2006 previously, and when they kind of enter what whales they saw, it would just be J-pod or K-pod or L-pod, with not really specifying what matrilines were there, because at the time it was assumed that if you saw J-pod, you saw all of J-pod. If you saw K-pod, you saw all of K-pod. I think that actually looking at those serious differences and looking at the effects not only of salmon abundance directly, but also the effects of whole population demographics and decreased, reproduction on this social behavior is absolutely a really, really interesting next step. And I think the point I hear most people make now is there's so many environmental factors kind of involved here. There's so many potential things that it's going to take a lot of modeling and a lot of data to actually disentangle any of these different effects. Yes?
When you are observing these sort of cross-pod groups,
Yeah.
do you find that they're to be found more often in one particular sort of general location, or do they kind of do what they've done when they're not in those cross-pod groups, insofar as they're seen more in the sound and islands or out to sea?
That's a great question, especially with some evidence that's coming out that maybe foraging happens in particular areas and socializing happens in particular areas and resting also. The short answer is, in the data we have, there doesn't seem to be any effect of location on the particular cross-pod associations we were looking at. LA7, no matter where J-pod is pretty much with J-pod. It's not the same this year, but last year, pretty much any time we saw the JA subgroup, we saw K14s. And it wasn't, during foraging bouts particularly, or during mating and socializing particularly, or during travel. It was pretty much a consistent thing. And just from our initial kind of examination of behavioral budgets, it doesn't seem that they really differed all that much from the behavioral budgets of just a single pod group. That's a great question. Thank you.
When you see the members of the three different pods getting together, does this suggest maybe that there's a creation of a fourth pod?
Well, and that was kind of the question we were asking, right? That repertoire analysis, and that was kind of my first idea when I first went very what's the word? Kind of exploratory data from this for a poster session at my college. The title of it was Pod Reformation in Southern Resident Killer Whales. But based on the repertoires, that doesn't seem to really be the case. It seems to be that they are forming cross-pod groups, but they're not, the only real definition of a pod that makes sense anymore is to look at these unique repertoires. And the repertoire of this cross-pod group is way more variable and really seems to represent multiple pod repertoires coming into a single group. But then,
Do you see calls from the cross-pod subgroup, which Brandy and Onyx, sort of leading into the other pods at all?
that's a good question. So, you're asking, do we see the any new calling behavior from that group being transmitted into the single pod groups that they occasionally associate with.
Right.
That is a great question that I cannot answer at the moment, given the data we have. It's a really interesting idea, because even though they're not preferred associates, they do still spend time with other individuals that aren't in that cross-pod cluster. So any new innovations that happen could spread. There's a great idea, oh god, who said it? I'll regret not remembering who said this, but killer whales are not great innovators, but they are really great learners. So it's kind of rare for a new idea to come up in a killer whale group, even in kind of a bizarre social group like this. But once it happens, say, we haven't seen this, let's say a new call type is formed, it can spread like wildfire. They're really good at learning from each other. So that's a very interesting idea. I hadn't really put much thought into that.
Anything else?
I'm going to get you guys out of here so quick.
It's going to take him a while to back up, so feel free to keep asking, but for now, join me in thanking